House of Israel International Services are held weekly at 3601 Rose Lake Drive, Charlotte, North Carolina, 28217, 11 a.m. Saturday mornings and 7 p.m. Thursday evenings, Eastern Time. This live broadcast is made possible through financial contributions from brothers and sisters like you. Your financial support is greatly appreciated. Thank you. Motivating. Inspiring. Challenging. Encouraging. Deepening. Strengthening. And enhancing your faith. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to House of Israel International's live worship service.
Again, today we're going to be discussing the introduction, and this is the gospel according to Matthew. We're going to look at some historical information that I believe will help us going forward. And this may be a very short teaching, but I think it'll be a very informative teaching. Matthew opens up in the very first chapter with these words, the book of the generation of Yeshua Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, Matthew's perspective of Yeshua automatically connects him to the royal house of David. And by doing that, many have concluded that Matthew presents Messiah as king and as the royal bloodline. And ultimately, we know that Messiah would be recognized, whether it be mockingly or factually, by those who mockingly call him the King of the Jews. And so Matthew recognized Yeshua as the family of David, and understanding as we're going to get through it, he is going to take us from from Abraham to David and all the way up to Messiah and beyond. So Matthew's opening statement, as I say, it connects Yeshua to the royal bloodline of David, and therefore he identified Yeshua as being of royal heritage. Now, how Matthew came to that conclusion, I would dare say, is based on the information that was shared with him, but also his knowledge, because Matthew is going to give us a genealogical account of the lineage of Yeshua. And you know, as any of us here today, to try to find your heritage is not always the easiest thing to do. I mean, some of us, we can go back to our grandfather or our great-grandfather or grandmother, and some even be to great-greats. But for many, it's a little bit challenging to go beyond that. Well, Matthew goes all the way back to Abraham. And so one have to ask, well, how would he know that? And here is where you'll find, because when we look at Matthew's occupation, we're going to find that Matthew was a very learned and a very educated individual. He was a professional in his occupation. Looking at the background of Matthew provides perspective and points of views from his perspective and how he see or saw or bear witness to what he have seen. And as I was thinking about this morning, I was thinking about, growing up in Mississippi and the various churches that I saw around and the culture in which I grew up in. And even in Mississippi, because our community was divided by railroad tracks, where you had the white community on one side of those tracks and the black community on a different side of the tracks, that even the Baptist churches within the communities worship different. There was differences in choirs and differences in how people interpreted certain aspects of the various books of the Bible. Matthew had two names. He was also named Levi. And in Mark chapter 2 and Luke chapter 5, we can see. And so these Gospels, it tells us who Matthew was, how he was viewed, his father, his brother, and his mother. But you got to look for these things in order to be able to identify them. And so in Mark chapter 2, verse 14, and Luke chapter 5, verse 27, we read, "And as he passed by, he saw Levi." He saw Levi. Now, Levi and Matthew is the same person. But if you didn't know that, you would assume that Levi is somebody different. And here it says Levi, the son of Alphaeus. So here we identify who Matthew's dad is. He saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the receipt of customs, and said unto him, "Follow me." And he arose and followed him. Now, when you look at the list of the 12 apostles, in those lists of the 12 apostles, you don't see anybody named Levi. But Matthew, you see Matthew, and Matthew is in all of the lists where the apostles are listed. John doesn't have a list of all the apostles, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the book of Acts all have who Yeshua's 12 apostles were. But in any of those lists, none of them list a person named Levi. And so we see that Matthew is also called Levi in Luke, and then in chapter 5, verse 27 of Luke, it says, "And after these things he went forth and saw a publican." So now we identify his occupation, his profession, named Levi. So Levi was not only Matthew, but we see that Levi was a publican sitting at the receipt of custom, and he said unto him, "Follow me." Now, what these verses do is it shows that when the Romans required, or when customs were collected in the land, that it was these publicans or tax collectors, and Matthew was one of them. Matthew's father, as we already noted, was named Alphaeus, and we saw that in Mark chapter 2. And here's something, when you look up Matthew's dad, you will see something that will cause, hopefully, you to look a little deeper than to get stuck on just trying to get the definition of a particular word or identity. As I was preparing this morning, I thought I would just share with you, as I've shared parts of how I develop messages. And I think it's important for all of us that when we're reading, because for me, I'll read and then I'll ponder. And then my typical is I get up and I walk around because, I think better on my feet. And in that, I'm asking questions. And then I get thoughts in my head. And I've come to realize that there are different ways by which Father communicates with me, because I've just observed how he does it over the time, over the past. And so I'll get a thought in my head. And when I get a particular thought, if I'm meditating on a particular thing, then if a word comes to me or a verse comes to me or something, then I go and I search that out. And in that, I find these connections as far as how Father communicates with me, and it opens up another avenue of study to build on what I'm already studying. And so when I began to do a search of Matthew and then come to realize that his name was Levi, and then I searched Levi in all of the places in the Bible, and specifically in the New Testament. And when I did that, I found that there were Levi in reference to the tribe, and then I found there was a Levi in reference to a person who was actually in the gospel, not associated with the tribe. And so when I go over there, I see, okay, Levi is the son of Alphaeus, but Levi is also Matthew. And so now I check out who is Alphaeus. And when I look up Alphaeus, I come to realize that Alphaeus is mentioned and connected to two people in the New Testament, and one of them is named James. And is identified as James the Less. Now, in your Bible, you may look at James the Less and you say, well, why is he called less? Because there's a James the Greater. Well, who's James the Greater? And then I come to find out that James the Greater is John's brother, James and John, the son of Zebedee. So when I see James, as it lists in Yeshua's disciple list, I know now there's two James. So whenever I see James in the Bible, I got to understand which James it is, because there's more than one. Right? And so now when I connect this James and separate him from James, the brother of John, I come to realize that James the Less, father who is named Alphaeus, has another son named Levi, also called Matthew. So now I see James the Less and Levi/Matthew are brothers. So now I see that not only is there James and John, who are brothers, who are disciples of Messiah, I see Matthew and James, the other James, as brothers as well. But then I also know that Thomas, called Didymus, which means twin, has a twin brother, and we don't know who he is, so he's not part of it. What you're going to find is that several of Yeshua's disciples were related. This may not mean much to you, but it helps me to understand community. It helps me to understand even when it comes down to when Yeshua chose his disciples and looking at the communities that they came from, the positions that they may have had in their community, in their outlook, based on the region they lived in and how they were viewed by individuals in other regions. Because Yeshua being from Nazareth, and nothing good comes from Nazareth, at least that's how some saw it, and then being in Galilee and understanding the regions, Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, I realized that Judea, the people of Judea, first of all, despised the people of Samaria and looked down on the people of Galilee. When I look at the book of Acts and I see the day of Pentecost, then I see and can understand better why they were able to identify these individuals. How is it that they speak, being they're all Galileans? And so all this stuff is connected, which means that when you approach the word, you have to devoid yourself of your preconceived understanding, or you will not see what's right there in front of you. You'll look over. You'll overlook. You're not engaged. And if this book is alive and living, it's important for us to get engaged in it, which means that I have to step out of my present and step into the time because if I step into the time that it is written, I have a much better understanding of how to take what was written in its time and to apply it in my time. I don't try to force my time in the scriptures, but I learn the time of the writings and how to apply them in my time. It's a dangerous thing to read the book with a modern frame of mind, because we are so far removed from the way things were and how they were written, to the point to where even now modern theologians are looking at the Bible from a modern perspective, and now they're trying to apply modern day times to make them applicable in Scripture. This is how a man or woman or person can develop the mindset to begin to retranslate, reinterpret, and then try to bring the Bible into modern times for a modern person. This is how you can see homosexuals and lesbians and gays and transgenders identifying themselves in a book that clearly calls that kind of behavior abominable. Well, in modern times, it's no longer abominable because it's being retranslated. It's being reinterpreted. It is trying to be made applicable to this modern time, to where everything is acceptable and it's all about love. Well, we have to go back in time and look at the intent. And this is one of the things that you'll find even in the legal realm, especially when it comes down to the governing documents of any country or nation or people. You have to look at the framer's mind and intent. And so for us, we have to look at the Almighty's intent. His intent is the only intent that matters. It's not about what you think. It's about what he said, what he meant when he said what he said, because ultimately that's how he's going to judge how we apply what he said. And so Alphaeus means changing. He's the father of Levi the publican, and then he's the father of James the Less, so-called, one of the apostles. So James the Less is one of the apostles of Yeshua, and Levi or Matthew is also one of the apostles. Now, the interesting thing about this particular statement is that, notice, put that back up. If you're looking in a certain dictionary and you see this definition, where is Matthew in there? He's not. You see that? You see Levi, but you don't see Matthew. So you won't make the connection unless you know Matthew is Levi. And this is how people's minds, when they study the scriptures, their minds based on the writers, because you got to understand that I don't get it. I don't fully understand it, but I approach the word knowing that when I look at the tools that men develop, remember this whole worldview? Remember this whole culture issue? Because if I have a certain way of thinking and I want to direct you to a certain way of thinking, then when I create material for you that you study from, I'm going to be influential in your way of thinking. I can insert things and I can remove things, and if you don't know the difference, you will be taken down a path, not even knowing that you're being led down a path, even though you are doing your diligence to study. This is why I say, don't depend on one Bible dictionary. Don't depend on one translation of the Bible. Because the Almighty made it very clear that there will be those whose intent is to deceive. If a theologian is in a position to where they believe that homosexuality is acceptable, then you're going to see some of that showing up in the tools they develop. It's been interesting that as I've got tools, and when I look at these particular tools, and some of them want to explain or say the name. And here's one of those areas, brothers. I'm telling you, when you begin to approach the Bible with an open mind, there are things that you will begin to pick up that you won't otherwise pick up. So I've got these tools, and the tools now are compatible to the Strong's numbering system. And those of you who know about the Strong's numbering system, if you've got a Strong's concordance, they associate every Hebrew word to a number and every Greek word to a number. And here's what I've seen in some of these tools that have commentary but are associated with the Strong's numbering system. In the commentary, they use Yahweh. But then they give you the Strong's number that takes you to Yehovah. So which one is it? And what you see is the bent, the mindset, the mind frame of the commentator while using the tool of Strong's. You follow me? And in many of these online tools, when a person writes a book according to the way things are done here in America, if you write on a particular subject and you use somebody's information, you now have to list them in the area where you list your references. So, if I write a book on a particular subject and I'm the first person to write a book on the subject, and then somebody else decides they're inspired to write a book on a similar subject, but they want to use subject matter, they're going to quote me. If somebody else writes a book, then they're going to quote the person who also quoted me. If they don't like me, they'll leave me out and quote that person. And so anytime you see books, you also see oftentimes bibliographies of who they quote. I've read bibliographies by writers who quote themselves. It's like, how you gonna quote yourself in your writing? See? So if you're going to look up the quote, what are they doing? They're directing you to another writing they wrote. You follow me? So your view and what you conclude is going to be what they want you to conclude. Which is why you have to go outside of those areas. It may be a little bit uncomfortable, but if you want a full or better or more robust understanding, and then you have to trust yourself not to be stupid or ignorant or gullible. Because here's what we will do if we're not careful. We will gravitate to the ones we like that agree with us and agree with them. The reason we agree with them is because they've already agreed with us. And when you do that, you are stuck in a certain way of thinking. And it is very dangerous to get stuck in a certain way of thinking when you're approaching his word. What you want now is the mind of Messiah, not the mind of your professor. You don't want the mind of your instructor, the mind of your rabbi or your apostle. You want the mind of Messiah, because the mind of Messiah will say your apostle is wrong. What your apostle and your prophet is saying does not align with what is written, which is why you'll have people who have belief systems that don't align with what is written. Why? Because they've agreed with or come in agreement with their apostle, their prophet, their rabbi, their teacher, their professor. And this is how people are able to separate you from the truth. Remember, we have an adversary who come to steal, kill, and to destroy. And the only way he can effectively do that is he separates you from the truth. He will give you a truth. You want to make sure that the truth you have align with his truth, or you will be on a different truth path, which now you're being led down that path and away from his truth. So here's another thing about Matthew. We know that Alphaeus is the father of Levi and the father of James. We know that Matthew and Levi is the same person. Matthew and Levi was publicans, tax collectors. And so for those of you who are joining us and you didn't hear the previous, Levi and Matthew is the same person in the New Testament. We're not talking about the sons of Israel. We're talking about Matthew, who's also known as Levi. Now, in Mark chapter 15:40 it says, there were also women looking on afar off, among whom was Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Less. So if Alphaeus is the father of James the Less and Mary is the mother of James the Less, is it safe to conclude that Alphaeus and Mary was the parents of James the Less? So if Alphaeus and Mary is the parents of James the Less, would it be safe to conclude that if James the Less is Levi's brother, then Mary, the mother of James the Less, could also be associated with Levi or Matthew and possibly be his mother? Let's see. So what did we just do here? First of all, we said we're starting with Matthew in the introduction. Secondly, we identified that Matthew and Levi is the same person. Third, we've identified Alphaeus as being Levi's father, which means that Alphaeus is Matthew's father, because Matthew and Levi is the same person. We also identified that Matthew and Levi is Matthew, who is Levi, is the brother of James the Less. And then we made the connection between James the Less and Alphaeus. And here we make the connection between James the Less and Mary. Now notice there was Mary the Magdalene, or Mary from Magdala. There is Mary, the mother of Messiah. There is Mary, which is also considered the other Mary in some places. And so we've got all these Marys. So when you read about Mary, you can't assume you know who Mary is. Did y'all see what we just did here? And I'm hoping that I'm broadening your way of thinking so that you will be more well-rounded when you approach the scripture and not make assumptions, but search things out. So there was also women looking on afar off, among whom was Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Less, and of Jose and Salome. Now, notice that. Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Jose, Josie, and Salome. Do you see that? So, again, we've identified that James the Less is Matthew's brother. Matthew, Levi is mentioned in all the Gospels except John. We identified that. Matthew's occupation, we identified as being a publican or a tax collector. Now, a tax collector of Roman revenue was somebody who worked for the Romans. So, Matthew is a Hebrew who works for the Romans and collecting taxes. It would be like the IRS man of today, or woman. And then these individuals could be chief tax collectors or ordinary based on their positions. Tax collectors were noted for imposing more taxes than were required so that they might grow rich more quickly. They were dishonest in a sense by adding to, if you're sitting there collecting taxes, and you got to understand that from a toll perspective, that if you get on the toll road, you got to pay, right? Anybody ever traveled across these United States? There's ways you can go to avoid the tolls, and if you get on a toll road and you don't know you're on a toll road, guess what? You're going to get a bill from the toll collector's booth. Well, those individuals, when they send you that letter, or that letter is printed out or whatever, Matthew was in a position to where, okay, if you want to enter in, this is how much you're going to pay. If you want to leave, this is how much you're going to pay. If you want to be counted, this is how much you're going to pay. And they set the price. So the publicans of the New Testament were negatively and regarded as traitors and apostates. Now, I wanted to point this out because the tax collectors were considered to be the lowest of the low from a Hebrew perspective. These individuals are individuals who have sold out. They're traitors. They've joined Caesar's oppression of the people. And what Caesar did, and this is very similar to politics, because you'll notice something about politicians. Politicians can enter into politics broke, poor, but they don't lead that way. They usually somehow, while in the public service, find ways to increase their coffer. And some of these people, they've figured out, like I'm looking at I serve, our ministries in North Carolina. I live in South Carolina. And though I'm not into politics and don't have dogs in those fights, I watch politics. To me, it's reality TV. That's what it is. See, while other people are watching Kardashians and all that junk, I'm watching politics. So I watch all the debates, Republican debates, Democratic debates. I watch governors. I watch federal, state, city. I watch the mayors. And I'm watching the amount of money these individuals raise in order to get an office that pay a fraction of the amount of money they raise. So right now I'm in South Carolina, and our state senator is, our senator in Congress in Washington is Lindsey Graham. Well, he's being challenged by Jamie Harris. And Jamie Harrison has raised buku millions. I mean, millions and millions of dollars. Now, you got a person who's going into public service and generating millions of dollars. What happens if they don't spend that money on their ads and whatever? They keep it in their coffer. They roll it over. They figure out ways of dispersing it under the radar. They begin to create shell companies. They move money around to the point to where somehow it finds up in some family member's business or some business they created or whatever the case may be. And when they leave public service, and this is not just a Democrat issue. They found these guys with stacks of money in their freezers. Showing favors, passing legislations and bills, and then redirecting that greasy palm funds, bribes, or whatever you want to call it, into whatever area they want it to be redirected to, so it's not necessarily connected to them, so that they can continue to present themselves as something ethical. Yeah. Anyway, talking about publicans, tax collectors. These guys figured out a way to fleece the people. Now, folks will point at preachers, right? They'll point at preachers while at the same time ignoring these charlatans that now supposed to represent them and give their power to. You see, that's the electoral process. That's how the voice of, that's how your voice, listen, if you want your voice to be heard, speak up. Why you want to give your voice to somebody else through what you call a vote? And then they get your vote and go represent themselves. Right? It's like if government is for the people, by the people, supposed to represent the people, who do the government represent when the people are divided? And I'll tell you something, that old adage of divide and conquer, politics, it plays out every single day by dividing the people and conquering the people and pitting the people against each other while crying out for unity. It's such disgust and deception, and logical, spiritual-minded people can't see it. They actually think they're doing God's work. Really? If people would speak the gospel and share their faith, you would be doing the work of the Almighty. Let me tell you something. I wasn't planning on going here, but we're in that cycle. The politicians then gave the people a bailiwick or platform by which they get them narrowly focused so that they can divide them. That's what they do. And then you got believers running out there talking about, how could you vote for somebody who believe in this? You know what I'm talking about. That's shaming. That's guilt playing. That's manipulation. But that's the games they want to play. Publicans were negatively looked at because they worked for the oppressors. They didn't work for, and here you got a system now. You got Hebrews who have seen the deceptive practices and the hypocrisies of the religious leaders and their systems, and have turned away from that religious system and its hypocrisy and joined forces with the oppressive government that is supposed to now be looking over and keeping order. See, the Romans provided law and order. And the law and order that the Romans provided, they engaged the publicans and even the religious leaders in the days of Yeshua, because they had a king that was appointed by Rome, not from the house of David. The king, they had a high priest that had been appointed by Rome, that was an illegitimate high priest, operating in the house, the temple. And so when you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if you look at it from the perspective of the word of Jehovah, you'll see religious illegitimacy. You'll see kingdom illegitimacy. And the only legitimacy in it were the Romans. Matthew was hired by the Romans. He was a man of means and wealth. Matthew introduced the Messiah to his co-workers or fellow tax collectors. When Yeshua told Matthew, said, Levi, Matthew, follow me. Just as he said to the fishermen, they left their nets, followed Messiah. Matthew left his tax collecting business and followed Messiah. Now here's the beauty. This really blesses me. I want to show you something. In Luke chapter 5, And Levi made him a great feast. So Levi quit the tax collecting business, took the money, and began to utilize his influence and resources to share with his co-workers about this one he was following. Luke chapter 5, verse 29. And Levi made him a great feast in his own house. And there was a great company of publicans and of others that sat down with them. Now get the picture. Levi, Matthew, listen guys, I've been at this publican business for a long time. I knew when I joined this publican tax collecting business, it's not something I wanted to do the rest of my life. I wasn't going to retire as a publican or a tax collector. I believe there's a calling on my life. Just the fact that I'm called Levi seems to associate me with the Levites. We don't know how much, but I know that the Levites were specifically set apart by the Almighty to do service in the kingdom. So Levi, Matthew has got this idea like some of us. You got a job, you got a business, you go and get a job, you work in employment, you do what you do, but you feel like there's some kind of calling on your life, and you don't know what that calling is on your life, so you do your business. The Messiah comes and says, Matthew, I want you to follow me. Now understand something. In order to follow me, you're going to have to give up or leave what you're doing. Matthew said, I knew there's a calling. I've accepted this calling. Now, he's letting his co-workers know. It's like, guys, I've been doing this public and tax collecting business for a long time, but the day has come for me to leave it be. Now imagine, why would you do that? This is a lucrative business. It's taking care of you and taking care of your family and all of the, you're just going to walk away? Well, I'm not just walking away. I'm leaving this for a higher calling. Really? Yeah. Listen, I'm not just leaving. I'm not retiring. I'm entering into my calling. And I really would like for you all to meet this person that I'm now leaving this for to go follow. I need you to hear his message. So what does he do? He organizes this great feast. And he invites all of his tax collecting buddies. He invites everybody he knows to come to his house. Say, hey, I want y'all to meet the man that I'm leaving all this for. And in Luke, it says he had a great company of publicans and others that sat down with him. But their scribes and Pharisees murmured against his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with publicans and sinners? See, this is how they've identified. This is what religion will turn you into. Religion will turn you into a person that looks at everything else as paganistic and sinful. And this is what the religious people had become, which means they thought they were righteous. They identified themselves as righteous, but within their hearts, they were open sepulchres, whitewashed sepulchres. They had a facade of religion, holiness, but inside they were contemplating murder. Inside they were contemplating, they wanted to hold people to the commandments, but in their own hearts they were violating them through their contemplation. And instead of looking to the one that the Almighty has sent, they set themselves up as the sent ones. Matthew identified and showed them who the real Messiah was, and the religious people condemned them because he was associating. See, there's something about a sinner who gets converted. The thing about a sinner who gets converted is still viewed as a sinner by those who knew him or her before they got converted. See, there are people who remember the way you used to be because they don't know the person you are. And you gotta tell them, and you gotta constantly remind them, because all they know about you is how they used to associate with you before you became the new you, and they don't know the new you, so you gotta educate them to the new you, because all they know is the old you. And so what Matthew is doing is he's evangelizing. He's calling all his tax collectors buddies. He know how they're viewed. He's calling people who may have issues with religion. He's not joining force with them. He's inviting them to come and meet a man. And they come, and the religious leaders are standing from a distance criticizing who they are and what they're doing. But they don't know that the people who are coming into this house, chances are they're going to leave a different way. Now, I don't know where Zacchaeus, you remember Zacchaeus? I don't know where he fit, if he was part of this, but at some point he heard about it. You see, the thing about the truth, brothers and sisters, is that it's going to change who you are. A publican is a renter or farmer of taxes. Among the Romans, usually a man of rank, a tax gatherer, collector of taxes or tolls, one employed by a publican or farmer, general, in the collection of taxes. And so we know that Matthew's work involved money. And I wondered what Judas's work was, because we don't know what Judas' occupation was. We know what Matthew's occupation was. And it seems to me, now this is just an internal question, I don't have an answer for it, but I'm constantly asking questions because somebody else may have answers. If Matthew was trained in the area of money, and it is very clear, why wouldn't he be the treasurer? I mean, this is just my thinking, because this is how we as humans think. Is that if somebody has a skill and expertise in a particular area and you establish ministry, you would want that person to operate in the area of their expertise. But our ways and his ways are not the same. The tax collectors were, as a class, detested, not only by the Jews, but by other nations also, both on account of their employment and of the harshness, greed, and deception with which they did their job. What's interesting is that Matthew is the only gospel that mentions the word church. And of course, we know the Greek, there is ecclesia, called out, this called out assembly. And so for the first 150 years, what people call the church, the early church, they looked at Matthew as the gospel for the church, because in the translation it had church, and was most quoted, according to Papias of Hierapolis, as quoted by the historian Eusebius. Have anybody ever heard of this guy Eusebius? Anybody got any of his writings? You have some of his writings? There are several historians. Philo is one, Eusebius is another, Josephus is another. And then if you look at the time in which they lived, you'll see that from their historical point of view, how close they were to the actual disciples and the time of the early assemblies. And so this guy, Papias, was during the time of the early assembly, and according to him, according to Eusebius, which came a little later, said that Matthew, this guy is saying that Matthew did a lot of writing. He just didn't write this gospel, but he wrote other writings, which wouldn't be far off, because if he was one who had been trained in keeping records, then there's a good possibility that he was very meticulous. And so when you look at his writings, how he takes us all the way back to Abraham, it shows that he had some knowledge of the history of the Hebrew people and was very meticulous in communicating it, even in the Numbers where he talked about from Abraham to the Babylonian captivity, from the Babylonian captivity to David, from David to Messiah, and he listed them as 14 generations. We'll get to that, but this is how meticulous he is in his numbers and in his genealogical searches and studies, because he's able to make that connection. And the only one else in the gospel writings who do that is Luke. Luke was Greek. He was a physician. Now, it's something about certain professions. Certain professions are required to keep meticulous records. They learn this in their training. They have to write reports constantly, every single day. Report writing, and present these reports. And then you got other people watching these reports, listening to these, or going over these reports to make sure that everything aligns itself. And Matthew came out of that type of environment. So now we get to who wrote Matthew. According to the early church fathers, it was unanimous in holding that Matthew, one of the 12 apostles, was the author of the gospel. When was it written? And here's where it gets a little challenging. Dating the synoptic gospel, Matthew 1:1, accordingly, some feel that Matthew would have been written in the late 50s or in the early 60s. This is the original date of his writing. And there's reasons, because of certain historical data that is not included in Matthew's writings. That should have been, like, for instance, the temple destruction. Then others say, they assume that Mark was written between 65 and 70, which placed Matthew in the 70s or even later, which also questions, well, if AD 70 was the destruction of the temple and Matthew was written later, because when Matthew is writing, the temple is still operating and the feasts and everything is still going on, and Matthew would have somehow included some of that, even Mark or one of the other gospel writers. And so here's a chart, and these are based on assumptions. Why am I showing a chart based on assumptions? Because we don't have facts. What we're relying on is historians and theologians to share with us based on their searching and researching of documents and poring over documents and separating the documents that are inspired from the documents that are not inspired and looking for data. The idea is that Matthew stands on its own. I believe Matthew stands on its own, and one of the reasons why, as I'll point out later, is that Matthew is the only gospel that is not questionable as to parts of its writings. And Matthew is going to reveal to us that this King of heaven and the gospel of the kingdom of heaven is going to commission the people to take the gospel of the kingdom to the world. Now, Mark gives us some information in Mark chapter 16, but most theologians say that that wasn't part of the early manuscript. That Mark 16, the latter part of Mark 16, wasn't. Now, I haven't seen the manuscripts, so I have to trust those who supposedly saw them and their information that they present to us in their writings to say, well, they say that, these signs shall follow them that believe in my name, and they shall lift, if they pick up any deadly thing or drink any deadly thing, or, what Mark says in Mark 16 and on, they're saying that these things were added later. But what Matthew says, as far as taking the gospel, it doesn't say the same. So these assumptions, I would conclude that Matthew was written before Mark, and that Matthew didn't look at what Mark wrote and then develop his gospel, because Matthew was an eyewitness, Mark was not. If anybody looked at somebody's writings, it would seem to be the other way around. Now, here's the million-dollar question. Who was Matthew written to? And this is a very good question, a question we should ask every time we read a particular letter or gospel or even prophets. We know that the book of Moses was given by the Almighty to give to the children of Israel. The book of Moses wasn't written to give to the Amalekites or the Canaanites or the Jebusites. It was written and given to who? The Israelites. Now, this is how people who are not Israelites can say that's not for us. Now, it's interesting how people can use certain logic because they say, well, that was for them, this is not for us, and then take something Paul wrote to the Romans and say, that's for us. Are you a Roman? Are you a Galatian? A Philippian? See, when you start getting into these logics of people, the logical doesn't seem to make sense when they're trying to present themselves as being logical. And it's not about trying to discount anything, is that you want to know if he's writing this to the Galatians, how can I take what is written to the Galatians and apply to me, not being a Galatian? Because if I can do that, how can I reject that which was written to the Israelites? You follow me? Now, Matthew, according to his writings, was written in Greek, but Matthew was Hebrew. We know early on that there were Greek-speaking Hebrews. The very beginning of Acts chapter 1 and 2 shows us that there were Greek-speaking Hebrews, and there became an issue between the Greek-speaking widows and the Hebrew-speaking widows by Acts chapter 5 and 6. So you had people who spoke Greek because the language of the time was Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. It was obvious who spoke the Latin. The Greek introduced itself when Israel became conquered by the Greeks. And so the intertestable, the intertestament books, the Apocrypha, and all of that, where, you got individuals celebrating Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a celebration of the Hebrews rejecting the Greeks as it related to not incorporating the culture of the Greeks, but it wasn't the Hebrew, it was a certain family. Before the Maccabean War, there were a whole lot more Hebrew that had accepted and incorporated into the Greek culture than there were Hebrews who rejected the Greek culture. And so the Greek culture was prominent in the time of the Gospels. The Romans were Latin. Who were the Greeks? Why is it written in Latin, in Greek, and in Hebrew? Because there were many Greek-speaking Hebrew who didn't speak Hebrew. They spoke Greek. And this is how theologians today can say that the New Testament is written in Greek and the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Well, can I tell you that all the Old Testament is not written in Hebrew? It's translated into Hebrew. And if you don't understand that translation, you have to ask yourself, when Moses was talking to Pharaoh, did Pharaoh speak Hebrew? We know from the study of Joseph and looking in the book of Genesis that Joseph spoke Hebrew, but he spoke Egyptian because he used a translator who took the Egyptian language and brought it into the Hebrew. Pharaoh spoke Egyptian. So all of these these exchanges between Moses and Pharaoh, you don't see a translator. Now, here's something interesting. Moses was brought up in Egypt. So Moses could have easily spoke to Pharaoh in the Egyptian language because that's what he was brought up in. The people, when they brought Israel's body back into the land, confused the Israelites for Egyptians. And yet, in none of those exchanges do you get the impression that anybody spoke Egyptian. Why? Because it's translated from the Hebrew language. Well, guess what? It was translated from the Egyptian to the Hebrew, and during the Babylonian captivity, the Babylonian language, which is why for many in the Hebrew culture, they have a Babylonian calendar. The names of the months come from the Babylonians. The Gregorians come from the Romans. And all I'm saying, brothers and sisters, is that let's take off these religious goggles, this religious mindset, and try to approach this book of life like it's a book of life. Because when you look at the book of life produces life. It produces life. if you look at it as a book of life, because it will transform you, and now you'll be operating in the life that the book presents to you, and you will want to share this life that brings freedom to you with other people so they could be free. They're not going to be free by your religion, your doctrines. You've got to present to them truth and be open to admit that you may have operated in religion. If that's all you had, that's all you had. But religion doesn't set you free. It's truth that sets you free. And the more you enter into this life that comes from the Word, you start shedding the shackles of religion. You start shedding the shackles of the world. You start shedding the opinions of men, the fear of man. You start coming out of those systems that the world has shackled you to. And this is why I hit politics so much, because politics has shackled religion. It has divided the religious. And it's got religious people who are supposed to be spiritually minded operating from a world's perspective. Talking about I'm in the world, but I'm not of the world. Then why are you in a world system? Why are you operating from a world system perspective? Why are you trying to change the world through politics and not the gospel? Messiah didn't give us politics to take to the world. He gave us the gospel. It's the gospel, the truth of the gospel that make men free. You gotta unshackle yourself from the idea that America provides you freedom and that the military secured your freedom. The military ain't secured your freedom. You still can't go where you want to go. You can't leave this country and go wherever you want to go, whenever you want to go, without the documentations. They didn't need documentation in the Bible to go from place to place to place. They didn't need a passport. Time has brought us into systems of government and systems of thinking to where now we look at the Word of God through our political lenses. And I won't shut up about this. I won't shut up about it. If Yeshua was here, you think he'd be a Republican or a Democrat? What party you think he'll be a part of? See, the Republicans say he'll be a Republican. The Democrats say, well, he'll be a Democrat. It's like, well, how can you be a believer and vote that way? How could you be a believer and vote that way? You see how this war, we're fighting wars that aren't even biblical. They're worldly. They're secular. And we've been caught in it so much to where we forget that it's not about your political party who makes you who you are or who set you free. Nor do you have to try to maintain. See, you don't have to fight to try to maintain your freedom, because whom the Son sets free is free. Well, I got to fight for freedom. And we can't forget the man who died and gave that. I mean, that's a beautiful song. I'm not knocking the song. I'm just saying this patriotism and all of this stuff that's associated with it, if you're not careful, it'll have you preaching another gospel. There's only one gospel, and that's the gospel of the kingdom. And the gospel of the kingdom is not subject to a world government. You can talk about New World Order all you want. One world government, you can talk about all. There's only one world government that will ever be established in the world. And that's the government Messiah comes to establish. Every other effort will fail. So Matthew is writing to Greek-speaking readers who are obviously Hebrew. They also seem to be known as it is written as Jews, but we know what that means. Many elements point to Hebrew readership. Matthew's concern with fulfillment of the Old Testament records or records more quotations, and that's what Herod's lineage. Herod the Great, Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas, the other Herod, they're all from the line of Esau. And so Matthew says, listen, David's line from the line of Judah, which he traces all the way back to Abraham through Judah to David, and where Father says the scepter will never leave the house of David. It will never leave David's line. And what the Almighty established then is that the king of Israel would always be from the tribe of Judah. Matthew establishes that. His readers understood that. They knew that. Matthew could be considered as an evangelist early on, for he wanted his co-workers and fellow tax collectors to know who Yeshua was. Matthew leaves his audience with instructions from Yeshua on what they are to do. Matthew records what we know as the Great Commission in the last chapter of his gospel account, when he says, "Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world." And even with that, Messianics and Hebrews and people of other, they focus on Father, Son, the Holy Ghost. People will find something to focus on to make some kind of argument or stand. And here's where your culture comes in. Because if you were brought up in an environment that taught this baptism formula, what will you be baptized? And so I just want to leave you with a couple of things. The baptism formula from Matthew is the most used formula for many today. One, a Baptist immerse in the name of Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. A Catholic sprinkle in the name of Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. A Pentecostal immerse in the name of Jesus. So how is it that a Pentecostal can read this, a Catholic can read this, a Baptist can read this, and come up with three different formulas? Because people will interpret what they read through their culture, how you believe. And that's the last slide. Shalom, saints. Tithing and giving first fruit offerings are critical parts of the believer's faith and has its foundation back in Genesis 4:4, when Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And Jehovah had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Abel was commended by Jehovah in Hebrews 11:4, where it states that by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. Solomon said in Proverbs 3:9-10, "Honor Jehovah with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall your barns be filled with plenty, and your presses shall burst out with new wine." The prophet Malachi wrote in chapter 3, verse 11 and 12, "To bring ye all the tithe into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, says Jehovah of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there should not be room enough to receive it." And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, says Jehovah of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for you shall be a delightsome land, saith Jehovah of hosts. When we tithe and give offerings consistently in obedience to Jehovah's commandments, we can count on him to keep his promises to us and consistently meet all of our needs. It is our Father's desire to bless you. However, it begins with you and your act of obedience to tithe and give offerings. Do it today. Shalom.
For more information, visit www.arthurbaileyministries.com or call 888-899-1479. House of Israel International Services is made possible through financial contributions from brothers and sisters like you. Thank you.